We're talking in this portion of the program with Quentin Brogdon. He is a personal injury attorney at Crain Brogdon, based in Dallas. And good to have you with us tonight.
Good evening, Jim. Thanks for having me on.
We're going to be taking a look at what I guess might be considered the cutting edge of both technology and the law, as there is an investigation now into a couple of fatal car crashes, which of course happen all the time. These, however, involved driverless cars. They were Tesla driverless cars, and this happened in Florida in each case. Your thoughts as an overview about the issues involved in these two crashes?
Well, Jim, we've had a series of crashes, not just involving Teslas, but there's been a predominant number of Teslas that have crashed since about 2016, so it's been over about the past 3 years. And these vehicles, including but not limited to Teslas, are crashing because these autonomous vehicles, they don't always see well, meaning their sensors don't always pick up their environments correctly. If there's rain or there's something that's changed, such as road construction or something else, and they don't always think well. They're programmed with computers to make certain assumptions about their environment and the actions of other drivers. And when things go wrong, they can go wrong with catastrophic consequences. And that's what we've seen most recently in these two most recent crashes, both that happen to be in Florida, one at the end of February and one in March.
Do you think that there is an effort here to push this technology faster than it's actually ready?
Many would argue that's exactly what's occurring. We've seen, for instance, what's happened with the Boeing 737 MAX. When companies are rushing, many would argue that's what happened with the MAX, the airliner that's now crashed twice in recent months. When companies are rushing out in a competitive environment to get out to the forefront, sometimes safety takes a back seat. We know to a certainty there are ethical issues when you bring out any new technology. There will be people who will die in crashes as this technology is refined and perfected, who would not otherwise have died. And our legislators and others who make these policies have decided implicitly or maybe even explicitly that the greater good is served. You know, more lives will be saved in the long run because more than 90% of all automobile crashes are caused by human error. So we're transitioning to the panacea, the day, one day when cars will be perfected and we will eliminate human error. But in the meantime, we have these partially autonomous vehicles where human drivers still have responsibilities. And it's an open question whether the designers of these vehicles are up to the challenge of keeping these human drivers engaged and vigilant. And many would argue that's not occurring.
I think that probably you will see the time when the driverless vehicles will be the predominant form of road transportation in this country, and that they probably will be safer. I remind you of the old story about the two guys being chased by the lion, and they're running, and the one guy says, "Boy, I don't think I can outrun that lion." And the other guy says, "I don't have to outrun the lion. I just have to outrun you." The point, of course, being that driverless cars do not have to be perfect. They only have to be better than what they would replace. And I've heard estimates, and again, I'm not sure the basis for the estimate. I've heard estimates that the annual, 30,000 killed on the roads in this country?
Something like
that could be reduced 90% down to about 3,000. As an ultimate goal, although I enjoy driving, I suspect that may be the wave of the future. But as we're talking right here and now, it does not necessarily happen to be the wave of the moment. At least it would seem. If in fact we not only see a few crashes, and again, a few crashes anecdotally do not necessarily prove a trend, but if there's a common factor in these, as our guest Quentin Brogdon says there is, that the vehicles are simply not up to the task. They are perhaps in a perfect environment, but goodness knows driving does not occur in a perfect environment. Then maybe it's time, despite what some people have put out there in terms of research dollars and the like, to simply say, back to the drawing boards, we'll see you in a couple of 3 years. Don't you think that maybe that might be a prudent course of action?
Well, so much, and this has been the trend of forever and a day, the touting of the safety of new technologies is always 10 steps ahead of the reality. And really, the automation of our vehicles has been going on much longer than people realize. In 1958, the Chrysler Imperial was the first commercially available vehicle that had a new space-age technology called autopilot. And interestingly enough, autopilot, that same phrase is now used by Tesla to name its system that some would argue Tesla has overhyped, has created an expectation that it will do the driving for you and it will beep at you when and if you need to put your hands back on the steering wheel. But in the meantime, you don't need to be vigilant. You can check emails. You can put your Tesla in autopilot mode. And there have been some spectacular crashes where people did just that. And lawsuits have been filed and claims have been asserted that Tesla, the company, and its salespeople overhyped, overmarketed the system and created a false dependency, a false sense of security where the drivers understood, based, among other things, on the name of the system, autopilot. That has a connotation of I can let the car do the driving for me safely.
Yeah.
And anybody who spent any time in a hospital and heard the beeping of the alarms and seen doctors and nurses ignore them knows that, an alarm that beeps at you, ostensibly to tell you to put your hands back on the wheel could readily be ignored by any of us over time as we drive the car.
Liability in a case like this, and I'll bet you this is an area in which the law and regulations have not come close to keeping up with technology. If a crash such as this occurs, who in fact is legally liable? Is it the person who is sort of almost the driver there? Or is it the person who programmed the computer? Or is it Tesla? Or who?
That's a great question, Jim, and that's being resolved really as we speak. Traditionally, in an auto crash situation, if you and I get in a crash, it happens within a state. You and I are both residents of that state, and I sue you or you sue me in state court, which is usually a simpler court to be in than in federal court, less formal, less, fewer procedures, quicker trial dates, etc. Traditionally, however, even today, in an auto products case, if you wanted to sue Ford Motor Company because of a defect in your Ford that killed you or injured you or maimed you or that rendered you a quadriplegic, you often ended up in federal court, a more formal court, because Ford is resident of Michigan. You're not in Michigan. It's an out-of-state defendant. So for jurisdictional reasons, you ended up in federal court. The question is whether going forward, if you are suing in one of these crashes, whether it's going to be more like a traditional products liability case where you have engineering experts, where you're in federal court, where it's more formal, it's more costly. And that is an open question. Another open question is insurance. Automobile insurers are literally having panicked meetings to determine what they should do with rates and premiums and other things because of the unknowns. Are there going to be fewer crashes? What are going to be the repair costs of these autonomous vehicles because they have more sensors and things in them? Are these automobile insurers going to be selling more insurance to companies such as Tesla and fewer policies to individuals such as you and I? Those are some of the questions that are yet to be resolved. And how often will these vehicles crash? How much safer will they be? In the short term, I think they're going to be less safe because they're in a partially autonomous mode, and there's a false sense of dependency created, and human drivers are ceding control of their vehicles, oftentimes with catastrophic consequences, including but not limited to decapitation and death. There have been one of the more recent cases, the Tesla goes up under the tractor trailer, and the driver is killed, horribly killed.
More to come. Stay with us. This is certainly a fertile field out there, and it's so often the case these days. Law and regulation have simply not kept pace with technology. And today, of course, technology expands at an exponential rate. So the problem has always been there, but it's a lot worse now. And law and regulation sort of poke along like it was a century and a half ago. More to come with our guest, Quentin Brogdon. Again, he is with the firm Crain Brogdon, based in Dallas. 1-866-50-JIMBO is our number, 1-866-505-4626. Would you ride in a driverless car today? Back in a moment. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. With personal injury lawyer Quentin Brogdon, we're looking at the recent fatal crashes of a couple of the Tesla Model S driverless cars in Florida, and the disturbing common thread that seems to exist in these particular fatal crashes, and that is that they just weren't reading the environment well. And goodness knows that's a critical part of what has to be done. I'm wondering the extent to which driverless vehicles will be dependent on sensors in the road, or appropriate road markings. Let's say maybe a white line that marks the side of the road, or lane markings and this sort of thing, because in certain rural areas, of course, you may barely have paving, and which would seem to indicate to me that that maybe we're not quite ready for the driverless car just yet, until we can come up with driverless vehicles that can handle what are sometimes primitive circumstances.
Jim, many people think that these vehicles rely on GPS, Global Positioning System, alone, but that's not correct, because GPS is only accurate to within 1 to 2 feet, not accurate enough to keep you necessarily out of the way of the 18-wheeler that's changing lanes. So they have a full bevy of sophisticated sensors, including LiDAR, which those are light waves, just under 1.5 million pulses per second, but they rely on line of sight, and they can literally map for the computer, for instance, the paint lines in the roadway, which is great until and unless you're driving on a road that's been resurfaced and it hasn't yet been repainted, or you're driving in weather where there's sleet or hail or rain, and that's interfering with the ability of the LiDAR to pick up the environment. They also have radar, which that's a system involving radio waves that dates back to World War II and before, ultrasound, sound waves, and then, of course, GPS. So they have all these sensors that feed inputs into the computer, and then the computer makes certain assumptions about the environment and the actions of other drivers. And part of the problem, and I alluded to this earlier, is these systems don't always see well because of the reasons we talked about, weather and environmental changes such as construction in the roadway, but they don't always think well because they tend to focus on moving objects and not stationary objects, and they tune out stationary objects. And there have been 2 different crashes, at least, involving Teslas, including one of the crashes last month in Florida, where an 18-wheeler tractor-trailer rig is turning across the path of the Tesla, and the Tesla goes up under the trailer. Back in 2016, when the first crash happened, it turned out that Tesla said and conceded that the system saw the tractor-trailer in the path across the front of the Tesla, but tuned it out because it presumed it was a bridge or some other overhang. And so the systems are designed to tune out certain things so it won't slam on your brakes as you're going under an overpass on the freeway. The problem is if you're going up against a trailer, maybe you need to be slamming on your brakes so you don't get decapitated.
As we go to some calls here, I would just have to note that the lesson here seems obvious, and that is, well, we're getting close. We're not there yet. We're not ready to put this out on the road. How is that not obvious?
I would agree.
I mean, and something else.
I would agree.
Let's assume that the people at Tesla do not care about human life. I would not say that as a fact, but let's assume for the sake of discussion that they do not care about human life. They do care about lawsuits and settlements. And I can assure you that it is not a smart practice, regardless of whether or not you care about human life or not. It is not a smart practice to engage in activities which can cost you $1 bazillion. Wouldn't you agree, as a personal injury lawyer?
Well, that's the beauty of our system, is it's designed to hold manufacturers and those who put products into the stream of commerce accountable when those products are defective. And a jury would have to decide whether a Tesla in a given situation was defective. All I'm saying is that in certain circumstances, the technology has not met the challenges, whether they're environmental challenges, whether the challenges of users. I would argue it's foreseeable that if you market a Tesla to me as something I can take my hands off of the wheel as I'm driving down the road, and you say in the fine print or somewhere else, well, put your hands back on the wheel if it beeps at you, there are going to be people who will not be vigilant enough, and some people will die or be seriously injured when they otherwise would not have been if it had been designed or marketed differently.
Again, any system which assumes human perfection or perfectibility is obviously an incorrect system. Here's a call from Willie in Sheridan, Wyoming, on the Jim Bohannon Show with our guest, Dallas-based personal injury lawyer Quentin Brogdon. Good evening, Willie.
Yeah, I'm a computer software engineer, and I work with some artificial intelligence things, and I've been paying attention to the self-driving car thing, and they're about as smart as a cockroach. I'm not sure cockroaches should get driver's licenses yet. But the thing I told the screener I wanted to talk about is the possibility of doing something malicious, designing a magnetic placard you could stick on a car that would look okay to people, but to a self-driving car, that car is now invisible.
Well, all right. I don't know why you would necessarily want to look invisible to a self-driving car. I can certainly understand why you might want to take, let's say, a self-driving tanker truck full of gasoline and drive it into a shopping mall if you're a terrorist. So take us down that road, if you would, please, Mr. Brogdon.
Well, it raises the issue, I think, of hacking and maliciousness, at least by implication. And that's a big concern. Even the GPS system is remarkably vulnerable. The GPS system, we don't realize how many things are keyed off of that. Banking transactions, clocks, you name it, our navigation systems, satellites. Things are keyed off of that, and there's great potential for hacking to occur. And so one of the things that we need to be concerned about is whether our cars are hackable and whether or not the manufacturers are taking sufficient steps. And it seems, and there have been articles and concerns written and concerns raised, that they are not being careful enough, kind of like our private information that's been hacked repeatedly now. We trust, the companies who have custody of that to be vigilant and good stewards of it, but that's not what occurs. And so these types of hacks aren't just possible, they become even more likely as consumers call for, greater convenience in their daily living, and they want to jump in their cars and be remotely connected, but hacking can occur and has been demonstrated to be quite possible. There have been reported instances where people have deliberately hacked automobiles already.
Yeah, and so that's of course with the consequences being much less than what they would be in a universe of driverless vehicles. More to come. 1-866-50-JIMBO in a moment. Thanks for being with us on the Jim Bohannon Show as we are talking with personal injury attorney Quentin Brogdon from the Dallas law firm of Crain Brogdon, and our number is 1-866-50-JIMBO. We're looking at the legal implications of the driverless car, particularly in an environment where there seems to be some evidence that we are rushing this just a little bit. Let's go to a call from Ed in Pleasantville, New Jersey on the Bohannon Show. Good evening, Ed, and welcome.
Hey, Jim, how you doing?
Fine, thank you.
I was just going to say that, we are kind of in the era of the horse and buggy of driverless vehicles right now. And imagine what was the accidents that would happen when the first Model T rolled off the assembly line and start before there was traffic lights. And that's kind of like where we're at right now. We should have developed smart roads before we develop smart cars, you know? And,
yeah, but we should. But the point of it is we would have to develop smart roads everywhere, or else we would have to somehow ban driverless vehicles from, let's say, going off the beaten path. And I mean, who would want a vehicle in which on the interstates you're fine, on most state and federal non-interstates you're okay. Don't even think about going to grandma's house out in the country. I mean, who would buy a vehicle like that, Ed?
Future, you know, one day we'll go from driverless cars to flying cars, and imagine the liability on that.
Oh, the flying cars. Well, that's a whole other thing. Interesting point.
100 years, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Let's bring that up with our guest here, and then I would note, by the way, for those who are not aware of this, that there are flying taxis in, I believe it's Dubai, the Gulf oil sheikhdom of Dubai. They're built by Germany, and if they're not running currently, they will be in a few weeks, and they will take you from hotel to hotel in Dubai. They're battery powered. Batteries last about 30 minutes, and when not in use, of course, they're charging, and they are pilotless flying taxis, drones big enough to carry people. You heard about those, Quentin Brogdon?
Yes, I have, as a matter of fact, Jim. I think Ed's question raises a very interesting issue. If you look back at the very first automobile lawsuits, you know, the first automobiles were very defective. Literally, steering wheels would detach from the cars as they were going down the road. And I think it was the New York Times or somebody said, you know, in the early 1900s, the automobile is dangerous only when it's run imprudently, and it's less dangerous than horses on the road ever were or will be. But what ended up happening was ultimately the law caught up with the reality, and our products liability law developed, and it began really in the area of automobile products liability. And there's a case that all lawyers have to learn. It came out in the 1915 or 16, McPherson versus Buick, and it was an automobile products case where a wooden wheel on a car was defective, and Buick was held liable for that under a products liability type theory. And then the law developed, and now we are where we are today, where, in a case like this, the operator could be sued, the manufacturer, if it's Tesla or whoever it is, the manufacturer of the component parts, if one or more of them failed, and then the developer of the software. I mean, those are just some of the defendants who could be sued in a case involving an autonomous vehicle.
Yeah. By the way, I think it was 1899, but a vehicle in Kansas City was involved in a crash with the only other vehicle in Kansas City. That's right. There were two cars in Kansas City. They managed to crash into each other. And also, I would note one other thing as we take another call for our guest, Quentin Brogdon, and that would be you never had to get a driver's license to ride a horse or to control a carriage. To William in Boca Raton, Florida. Good evening.
Yeah, good evening. I'm calling in because I've either owned or leased 3 Teslas. I have a Model 3 now, and if the car's driven the way it's supposed to be driven, it's very safe. And in fact, I understand one of the insurance companies will give you a discount.
Now, let me get this straight. This Tesla that you have, is this a driverless Tesla?
It has the hardware, actually. I paid extra for the driverless features, but the software hasn't been released yet.
So in point of fact, as far as you're concerned, this is just another car that you drive, and you control the brakes, you control the accelerator, you control the steering wheel, right?
When you want to, but I've driven it from here in Florida all the way to Connecticut and back, and I'd say 90% of the way I was on autopilot.
Most interesting. Now, what were there any moments in which you told yourself, "Boy, I should have been paying more attention"?
You really, in the new Model 3, that's difficult because about every, I'd say no more than 30 seconds, if your hands are off the steering wheel for more than 30 seconds, the car tells you, and you've got to get your hands back on the wheel, or autopilot will gradually disengage. I mean, you'll end up in the corner, so to speak, and you'll have to take control of the car, and you can't use autopilot until the car is parked, until the end of your drive. Your Tesla will punish you for not keeping your hands on the wheel.
Interesting. Most interesting.
Now,
Anything that you would like to ask our guest, or conversely, anything that Quentin Brogdon would like to ask William?
Well, I'll take any questions, but I know in the first Florida accident when the Tesla went underneath the truck that was white, and in that model, it was an earlier model, and in that iteration of the autopilot, it didn't recognize the white truck. The driver claims that there was a iPad in the seat of the car, and a Harry Potter movie was playing on it. So my point is, if you drive the car responsibly, it's totally safe and safer than what they call an ICE, an internal combustion engine car. But it's not just the powertrain of the car being electric. I just love electric cars. But
of course, there are any number of electric cars out there which are not driverless, and that, of course, is the key for our discussion.
Yes. And this car is the latest software version that came out in the last 2 weeks will make the car even more polite to other drivers. If somebody cuts in front of you or signals on their turn indicator that they want to get into your lane, your Tesla will slow down and let them cut in front of you. I don't know if I like that, but that's what they.
All right. One more point. Let me ask you this: during that trip, did you feel safe the entire time, or were you slightly nervous ever?
No, but that's because I'm on a Model 3 and I've had a Model S. I'm used to autopilot, and I drive it the way it's supposed to be driven.
All right.
And no, the autopilot, also something no one really talks about, is ideal. I've had this car in Santa Monica, or a Model X in Santa Monica on the LA freeways, and in heavy traffic, autopilot is fantastic because you can literally turn it on and it will stop and start and go and keep up with the 10, 15, 20-mile-an-hour traffic ahead of you, and stop when the car and the traffic ahead of you stops.
All right. Quentin Brogdon, anything you wanted to say to William?
Well, I think there are plenty of people, including obviously William, who are big fans of autopilot. And some of those people, the crash in Florida in October 2018, a man named Sean Hudson had a 250-mile round-trip commute. He used autopilot to make that commute on the Florida Turnpike, and he says he's now filed a lawsuit. He survived his crash, but what happened was it worked just beautifully until a very unexpected and unique situation arose, and in his case, it was a disabled, empty Ford Fiesta sitting on the turnpike, and his Tesla crashed right into it, he says, with no warning to him. And so he survived that and has filed a lawsuit in which he claims that Tesla has overhyped this, and that, and I would just say a system that may work perfectly 95% of the time, but if, those of us who deal in tragedies know that they occur when something unexpected happens, when there's construction, when there's a driver doing something that's not necessarily expected or predicted. That's when people die and are killed and are injured. And in certain circumstances, and I don't know the answer to this question, by the way, maybe on balance, the computer programming in the Tesla makes you safer and will save your life in some circumstances where you would have erred as a human driver. But certainly we're seeing some crashes occur where perhaps at least a human driver who was engaged would have avoided those crashes had they not been relying on the Tesla autopilot system.
All right. More to come. Back in a moment. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show at 1-866-50-JIMBO with personal injury attorney Quentin Brogdon. We're looking at some of the problems inherent in the current rollout of the driverless vehicles. And let's continue the conversation with Ron, who is in Tyler, Texas tonight. Hello, Ron.
Good evening, gentlemen. I've got a question. I remember going to the 1964 World's Fair in New York City, and there was a pavilion by one of the automakers in this country, and they had a driverless car there, even with video. Even though I was a child, I was very impressed. I wonder, whatever happened to that model? Are you aware of it?
This was at the 1964 World's Fair?
Yes, Jim.
Pardon?
I was a child, but I still remember it because I was shocked.
Okay, but that's where it was. I mean, it was obviously an experimental vehicle. Clearly, I don't know if Mr. Brogdon is aware of it. I personally wasn't aware of it. Are you, Mr. Brogdon?
No, I know at fairs and in other venues, the auto manufacturers will roll out concept cars that purportedly will do various things. It's very difficult to imagine in 1964 a true autonomous vehicle.
Yeah.
The computers at that time would fill a room.
Yeah.
Even the space shuttle. Somebody was talking to me not that long ago about the area in the shuttle at the end that had been reserved for computers. By the end, they were putting experiments in that area because the computers had shrunk so much. So I just can't imagine that a truly autonomous vehicle existed in 1964, but I don't doubt that perhaps an automobile manufacturer touted one, even though it wasn't truly one.
Yeah, and not only the size, but the reaction time and the amount of data that could be handled. Yeah, even if you had a tractor trailer truck and the entire cargo was computer, I question whether in 1964 it would have been able to handle all that would have been required. This is John in New Bedford, Connecticut now. Good evening, John.
Hi, how are you guys?
Fine, thank you.
So my question is regarding the fact that obviously all these lawsuits are very expensive. There's no doubt about that. It's probably hundreds of millions of dollars. But I'm wondering if you think that it's well worth it to a company like Tesla, who is obviously on the cutting edge, if it's worth paying out all this money in order to remain on the cutting edge because they're going to make so much money over the next couple of decades, I'm assuming, with all this.
All right. Mr. Brogdon?
Yes. Unfortunately, what we see is exactly the economic calculus that John is referring to. Companies make it all too often. Famously, Ford made the calculation in the case of the Pinto. There was an $11 part that could have avoided explosions when the car was rear-ended and could have saved, many, many, many lives. But Ford did the calculation that the payoff in those lawsuits would be less than what it would cost to put the part into all of the vehicles. So I don't know that that's occurring, but we know anecdotally and based on past circumstances and past cases that unfortunately corporations, they're not living, breathing humans. They make decisions based on economic realities as they perceive them. So yes, that may well be occurring here, and I would argue it is occurring more probably than not, that companies are rushing these out, and they're saying we will deal with the consequences of the lawsuit because the payoff in the event we get to the head of the line could be not millions, but potentially billions with a B.
Interesting. I would have thought the penalties for mistakes would have been made it not worth it. More to come, back in a moment. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show at 1-866-50-JIMBO. Joan in Long Island, New York is with us to talk with our guest, personal injury attorney Quentin Brogdon. Good evening, Joan.
Hi, Jim. Hi, Quint. My big deal is this. We are fast approaching the singularity, which is a term that was used when artificial intelligence becomes self-aware. And at that point, we're going to be at the mercy of the machines. And we can't deny it.
Well, I mean, we don't know, for example, that we will reach a point in which, in fact, the machines become self-aware, or if they become malignantly self-aware, as in the Terminator movies. What Joan is referring to is obviously a possibility, but with the rather primitive level of the intelligence that will go into these vehicles, I dare say we're not talking about cutting edge, I think, therefore I am robots, Quentin Brogdon.
Yes, I think we're conflicted. The Pew Research Center did a survey, I think it was in 2017. About half of us think these robots and the autonomous vehicles will decrease traffic accidents. Half of them think they'll increase them. A little over half of us wouldn't ride in the Navy. A little under half of us would ride. And it really goes back, you're right, back to our conceptions of robots. Are they good? Are they bad? Lost in Space, the TV show from the 1960s, Dangerville Robinson, I, Robot. There was a more recent version of it with Will Smith. So what do we think about robots? Are they evil? Are they bad? And that colors, I think, our perceptions of these autonomous vehicles.
I'm sure it colors our perceptions. I don't think that, again, we're at the point yet where we're talking about vehicles that are smart enough to be thinking, get off my back. I'm going to kill the people in this vehicle. I'm a little doubtful of being at that point. But could we get there? Yeah, I suppose we could get there someday. Lisa in Wilmington, Delaware. Good evening.
Hi, guys. My question is, do you think that the feature of cars known as cruise control is actually the infantile stage for today's driverless vehicles?
The infantile stage. Well, it's a form, obviously, of the vehicle taking over. It's very rudimentary, of course. Quentin Brogdon, you're on a stretch, presumably, of open highway, probably interstate, and it looks as though you're safe to go at a certain speed for quite a while. So that's about as basic, I guess, as automation can get for driving a car. Maintain this speed.
You're right, Jim. Some, at least, have dated the beginning of autonomous vehicles to the 1958 Chrysler Imperial. That was the first commercially available vehicle that had a feature called autopilot, which was basically just cruise control. So, yes, some have dated the beginning of the autonomous vehicle to 1958 and to the Chrysler Imperial until the cruise control feature. That's right.
But again, as we note, it was the beginning of this concept, but clearly that doesn't require a great deal. Basically, you just simply tell the accelerator pedal, maintain that amount of gas going into the carburetor or the fuel injection system. It's not terribly, shall we say, complicated. All right, about 30 seconds to go here. What's the main thing you think we should all think about regarding driverless cars?
I think we need to understand that they're not on their way. They're here. I think we need to understand that everything potentially is going to change going forward. I think we need to understand that we should not panic. Some are saying that our legal system needs some kind of wholesale revision, that the federal government needs to step in, that we need perhaps some kind of no-fault regime where we eliminate the ability under the Seventh Amendment to file a lawsuit. I think that is very much misguided.
Well, suffice it to say, time is elapsed. Stay on the line. We'll speak off air. Quentin Brogdon, the website crainlewis.com. I'm Jim Bohannon, and this is Westwood One.